Hi there, and welcome to Ancestral Recall, Magic's most comprehensive YouTube series on the history of Magic the Gathering. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan, chronicling more than 20 years of Magic, set by set. Today, we're starting our examination of Urza's legacy, the follow-up to 1998's Urza's Saga, and the continuation of some of the most broken mechanics in the game's history. In this episode, we're going to talk about the set's lore, the new spins on the mechanics, and some of the set's most famous cycles. Let's get to it! As a continuation of Urza's Saga, this set didn't have an overwhelming theme. Was this set about enchantments, or was it about artifacts? The set wavered between the two, but like Urza's Saga before, this set had many powerful cards. And before I go any further, we need to talk about a historic first. Urza's Legacy was the very first set with premium foil cards inserted. Prior to this, the only way to get foils was in Arena League or in other promotional situations. Some players felt uncomfortable playing with them in decks because foils felt just a little bit different than other cards, especially when unsleeved. Some players scoffed at them, saying that they were gimmicky, like baseball cards with pieces of players' jerseys attached to them. And some collectors went berserk for them. And foils were considerably less frequent in their first few years in packs, only showing up about 4 or 5 times in the box, whereas now the ratio is usually 6 to 8 foils in the box. Now the first foil card I opened was Phyrexian Broodlings, by the way, and I still have it. Somewhere around here anyway. But there's so much to say about foil cards, their pros and cons, and that's a debate I'll leave for another day. But to be brief, I'm glad they exist. Moving along. Lore. Planeswalker Urza now knows his enemy. Aware of the threat Phyrexia represents, he builds his stronghold of knowledge, artifice, and sorcery, the legendary Tolarian Academy. Here, he and his scholars recruit artificers and mages of all ages and types, and teaching young children how to become those mages themselves, seeking knowledge and craft to help fight the Phyrexians. He designs a skyship, and seeks out Multani, the Maro sorcerer of Yavimaya, to find the best material to craft it with. After a long, bickering negotiation that takes decades, Multani finally yields. But the Academy is beset with troubles from a temporal rift, with parts of the Academy shrouded in slow time, moving at the speed of erosion. And there is a Phyrexian assault wing, captured within the fast time bubble, not yet able to escape, but planning and plotting at 10 times the speed of the outside, from their perception while the mages toil away, oblivious to the threat at their doorstep. This is strong foreshadowing for the eventual invasion that players experience 2 years later. 2 of the legendary characters that show up on the cards are Radiant and Multani. Radiant is Sarah's lieutenant and advisor, who suddenly ends up as the Plane's sole leader when the Planeswalker suddenly departs. Despite her loyalty to her master's ideals, she cannot feel anything but spite for Urza for bringing the Phyrexians to such a sacred land. Her wrath grows despite her fellow angels' attempts to calm her. The more angels that attend her, the more her fury rises. As a Maro, a nature elemental and the incarnated sentience of the great Argothian forest, Multani is initially highly skeptical to Urza's request for support, but after Phyrexian agents vex the woods he shepherds, he agrees to deliver some of his own material to create the hull for the proposed Weatherlight project. Multani was a huge casual all-star as soon as he saw print, since his stats jumped for each player participating in the game, and his ability of Shroud was highly rare and desired at the time, particularly since the spot removal was so good. There's a novel, Time Streams, which I haven't read, which covers the events of the set. I mean, I've read The Invasion Cycle by J. Robert King, and while I was able to perfectly follow the story, I didn't care for King's writing style, so I didn't happen to track down Time Streams. It's just, you get burned by an author, and you really don't feel like following up. But if you've read Time Streams and want to talk about it in the comments, I love to hear your thoughts. And I'm also going to link to the Mana Sources lore video for a more blow-by-blow approach. I mean, I'd rather get into the juicier part of the set, the mechanics. I hate to say this, but Urza's Legacy isn't particularly innovative, to be honest. There are no new keywords. Cycling continues to show up, still fixed at 2 mana, and it's still a fun mechanic. Mana Leak gets a bit less efficient with Misdirection, losing 1 more mana in the taxing effect but picking up Cycling, so when you don't need it, you can draw another card. And there are some other new fresh effects like Swat, and there are some cycling cards that aren't so good. Echo is the mechanic that changes the most, moving from red and green to artifacts as well. And more importantly, the Echo cards now have come to the play, or should I say, enter the battlefield triggers. For example, the very first invitational card, Darwin Castle's Avalanche Riders, comes into play as a 2/2 hasty creature coupled with a Stone Rain. And if Darwin happens to make it through your next upkeep, well, you can pay 4 mana to keep him around. Often, many players just didn't let that happen, saying, okay, I'm fine with 2 points of damage and land destruction. With the exception of Karmic Guide and Crater Hellion, Urza Saga's Echo creatures were just plain big stat blocks. Gitu Slinger shows the smaller size and more spell-like effect of the new Echo guys. Raven Familiar was a cantripping creature, letting you get one of the 3 best cards on top of your library that you can choose to stick around for by paying the Echo again. And the free spells continued, of course centered in blue. There's Cloud of Fairies, a 2-drop 1/1 flyer that lets you untap 2 lands, or you can cycle it if you prefer. This is so Urza's Saga, it bleeds brokenness. That's why it's been banned in Pauper. Another famous free spell is, oh snap! Sorry, but Bismarcky's favorite card is a practically free unsummon. As a somewhat reactive spell, it's not that degenerate. Oh, and then there's the really broken spell, Frantic Search. Drawing 2 and discarding 2 can give a heck of a lot of utility, especially if you're into reanimation, or decks that make lands generate more than 1 mana. And while it isn't normally free, Memory Jar is one of the most broken artifacts of all time, letting both players put their hands aside and draw 7 fresh cards in the meantime. But since the controller chooses when this happens, the other player rarely has a chance to use their fresh cards, and the jar has a completely broken interaction with Stronghold's Megrim. In fact, Memory Jar is, to date, the only card ever printed that received an emergency ban in Standard, breaking Wizards' policy of having banned restricted list updates happen on a calendar basis. Suffice it to say that Memory Jar was another huge mistake in a block that was filled with mistakes. The free spells definitely contributed to the game's decline for the next 2 years, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any fun cards in Legacy. To the contrary, let's talk about some of them today. Let's start off with the most famous cycle from Urza's Legacy, the creature lands. The lands that could turn into a creature and attack or block. Well, the first one is from Antiquities, Mishra's Factory. The next one that saw any amount of play was Tempest Stalking Stones, a signature attacker in Randy Buehler's CMU Blue deck. But Urza's Legacy featured the first cycle of creature lands, lands that could tap for colored mana or turn into a creature of the appropriate color for 2 mana. These lands were wildly popular and saw significant play in Standard, giving just that more incremental advantage. This was extremely significant in eras where blue-white control with Wrath of God was extremely common. Finally, a creature that always slipped past Wrath of God. Deal with it. Now, the most play creature lands were blue's Fairy Conclave, which had respectable 2/1 flying stats, and green's 3/3 Treetop Village, which came with Trample. Once upon a time in Old Extended, when I was playing my favorite deck, I just couldn't get through my opponent's defenses with a huge Morphling, so I went into infinite turns, stacked up 1,000,000 counters on my Treetop Village, and trampled through for the victory. I was very proud of that trick. Now the white one, Forbidding Watchtower, was a stalwart blocker, and the black one turned into a Drudge Skeleton. The least effective of the cycle was Gitu Enchantments, but red control decks still packed it as a way to get those last few points in after wiping the board repeatedly. Thanks to this cycle getting reprinted in 10th edition, all of these lands are modern legal. So if you want to find a good way to support monocolored strategies and non-powered cubes, for example, these are well worth your time. Urza's Saga had a cycle of common enchantments that return to your hand after leaving the battlefield, and this set keeps the trend coming with another common cycle. Cessation is a good way to keep an attacker away, but still lets it block ad nauseum. Unsurprisingly, red gets Sluggishness, a mirror that it keeps a creature from blocking. Slow Motion, while obnoxious, is a great way for blue to tie up an opponent's mana in the early game. The card of this cycle, however, is Rancor. Recent Redditors joked about the hapless list of the most powerful cards in Magic that made the rounds on social media, and that list's author put Rancor at number 2, with only Black Lotus ahead of it. While Rancor clearly isn't that good, it is undeniable that the card enabled cheap, aggressive green decks like nothing had before. +2/+0 and trample on a 1-drop is quite a punch, and if you lose your attacker, well, okay, that's fine, the next guy in line gets a punch that hard again. Rancor was a much-needed shot in the arm for green, which, to tell you the truth, was looked down upon by most standard players at the time as the worst color. And rightly so, because prior to Urza's Legacy, green decks almost always sucked. Rancor made a major crack in that glass ceiling. It is definitely the card in the set that had the biggest impact on making the 5 colors more balanced. If you're interested in exploring fun cards for cubes, this cycle of enchantments is much stronger than its predecessor in Urza's Saga. There are also great engine pieces for cards that benefit from sacrificing enchantments or permanents in general. Just keep in mind that if the aura's target gets destroyed before the aura resolves, the aura goes to the graveyard for good. There's another enchantment cycle in this block, the sleeping enchantments that are effectively powerful sorceries on your upkeep, but only if the conditions are met. The most famous is Defense of the Heart, an EDH nightmare. In multiplayer games, it's very common for an opponent to have 3 creatures, so the prospect of searching your library for 2 creatures of your choice, regardless of their mana cost, and dumping them into play is extremely attractive. As in, if you play this card in EDH, people will start to come at you, because the combo potential for this card is through the roof. This is like Tooth and Nail at half the cost. Another sleeping enchantment that doesn't get enough EDH play is Planar Collapse, representing Urza's inhumane role in ending Serra's Realm. For a mere 2 mana, you get an enchantment that wipes all but the most lightly populated boards. Regeneration cannot save anyone from this reset button, and while you lose a lot of control over the effect in tying it to an upkeep and making it mandatory, the card's true advantage is in its status as a permanent. There are a number of cards, such as Skull of Orm, that allow you to repeatedly bring dead enchantments back to your hand. So yeah, if you want to keep boards clean of creatures, Planar Collapse is a stellar tool when properly supported. The other sleeping enchantment sorceries are Second Chance, a very conditional Time Walk, Brink of Madness, a sketchy discard spell, and Impending Disaster, which is a giant Armageddon in group games. And longtime viewers know how much I hate Armageddon effects in group games. Let players play their stuff in social formats. I mean, that's the point. Being social. Letting people do things. If you're a Vorthos who enjoys cube or other custom-built limited formats and want to express the roots of Phyrexia, this set has a fantastic vertical cycle that expresses how closely the plane is tied to plague and decay. Of course it's mono-black. Who needs new Phyrexians with their newfangled 4 other colors? Just kidding, I enjoyed New Phyrexia, but I still prefer the old school. These are the Carriers, the Bringers of Disease. At common we have Phyrexian Denouncer, a small but efficient 2-drop. We also have a quite good 4-drop 2-power flyer, Phyrexian Debaser. I used to draft these in junk drafts all the time, and they were superlative. The uncommon Phyrexian Defiler is an incredible problem solver of a hill giant, able to deal with many problematic bombs. And at the top of the heap of corpses is the Phyrexian Plague Lord, turning any creature on your table into a nasty pox carrier. The Plague Lord even saw some constructed play, and was the set's historical representative in 8th edition, a set which brought back many of the game's greatest hits. This cycle represents the later stages of Yawgmoth's efforts to breed armies to crush Dominaria, as creatures inherently bred for killing. Many of them are represented in the art on invasion cards. And the crucial thing to understand about this cycle is that they play very differently today than when they were fresh and new, because under 6th edition rules, creatures did damage differently. Combat damage went onto the stack, so there was a window where creatures could sacrifice themselves for effects and still have their damage happen in combat. Today, if a carrier or any other creature with an activated ability that requires a sacrifice gets into the combat and uses their ability, they no longer deal combat damage. This cycle's effectiveness has been nerfed pretty hard, but Wizards remembered them when designing later Phyrexians. So Scars of Mirrodin's Skin Render got to have the Defiler's effect as an Enter the Battlefield ability and stick around as a 3/3, providing a subtle homage to its forebears. My first drafting cube had 1,000 cards of cool commons and uncommons from Magic's first 10 years, and I always kept these guys in. But 10th edition rules meant that over time, they slowly got cut. Only the Defiler still has a home in my cube today. And yes, there is a cycle of instant cards that target two things, such as Rack and Ruin, with the pattern X and Y as the name. Rack and Ruin is the best of them, the rest are subpar. There's a lot more to discuss about Urza's legacy, but we'll come back to them next time. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode. And as always, remember, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.